Today we're going to be talking about how it is our belief can blind us to the way of Jesus. Back in 1984, I was just a young lad. I was 8 years old, living in Houston, Texas, out in the outskirts in a small town called Spring. And while I was living there, people tried to convince me that various ethnic groups were either some were good and some were bad. Some were inherently good and some were inherently evil. At the top of the pecking order, since I am ethnically Egyptian, of course, were the Egyptians. And then things kind of went down from there. And in my experience growing up, this really distorted thinking said that Egyptians are at the top of the pecking order, then come whites, then come Latinos, and blacks and Asians. Somewhere in that order. Okay? And this is something that I dealt with growing up, and I really wrestled with quite a bit. Now, before we jump on the Egyptians, regardless of what your ethnic or cultural group is, at some point in history, I think this is something that most cultures have struggled with. Most ethnic groups have wrestled with this idea. That there is a hierarchy of culture, of ethnicity, of nations, that God has called somehow us who are in America, like this is God's country, okay? This is God's country here in America. And those in Egypt believe that Egypt is God's country. And those in Israel believe that Israel is God's country. Well, this distorted thinking, I think, is really critical because it impacts not only how we view ourselves and others, but how we view God. Of course, in my house, I was reminded that Egyptians built the pyramids. We invented math and the first alphabet, writing, if you will. We also, of course, discovered America and invented the internet. We Egyptians, we did it all. Okay? Egypt was not a place in Africa, but rather Africa was an extension of Egypt. The cradle of the world, where all things began. And whereas these things may or may not be true, some of them, they certainly skewed my view of the rest of the world. They skewed my view of others. They prevented me, I think, from seeing other people as they were. And as a result, they distorted my image of God. They took me back to an Old Testament view of God, where there was an ethnic elite group. The truth is, most of us have struggled with this concept, regardless of your ethnic or cultural background. Most of us have been planted with this thinking at some point. This series that we're in, it's about the big mistakes and the simple solutions. I believe that there are big pitfalls that are avoidable and that are correctable, but we need to have proper awareness, correct orientation, and the right effort in order to deal with these pitfalls. During the Pope Francis visit on Tuesday, it was at the interreligious gathering when I had come out, some woman stopped me and she began speaking to me in Spanish. And thankfully, I was able to communicate just enough to understand her. And she says to me in Spanish, she says, "La Papa representa Dios en el mundo." The Pope represents God in the world. He is the representative. She says, "No?" Right? And I looked at her and said, "No. No. No, Mama. No, Senora." And she's like, we start exchanging, and I'll save you my broken Spanish. But we start going back and forth. And I realized a few things. One is that my Spanish classes did help me a little bit. But more importantly, is that her wrong belief affected her view of God, the Pope, and very importantly, herself. Her wrong belief that the Pope is the representative of God in the world distorted her own view of not only God, not only the Pope, but also her own mission in the world. And so what I tried in my broken Spanish to do was to communicate to her that the body of Christ is to represent God in the world. That you, Senorita, are also supposed to represent God in your own unique way to the world. A lot of wrong beliefs can blind us to the way of Jesus, and that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. So if the truth is the truth, why does this happen? If there is truth, why do we find these things going on? Like why, especially for those who have been raised with a Christian message, or raised having heard of Christianity, why does this happen? Like, why would we have some of these distorted thinkings? I'm going to share with you a number of distorted thoughts, and we're going to turn, if you have your Bibles with you, to Matthew chapter 16. It's a passage I know a number of you are familiar with. And there's one specific part where Jesus asks, "Who do men say that I am?" But within the context of that chapter of Matthew 16, there's a number of times where distorted thinking about who God is revealed. And I think there's certain things that we have to be mindful of as people who are looking, seeking to walk in the way of Jesus, to make sure that wrong belief doesn't distort our thinking about who God is. Because if we have a distorted thinking of who God is, trust me folks, that will impact how we deal with each other. That will certainly impact our worship. And no doubt it will impact how we deal in the world. How we deal within the body of Christ. How we deal with the broken. How we deal with the wounded. How we deal with what God has gifted us with. Matthew chapter 16. You open up in verse 1 and it says, "Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and testing him asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said to them, when it is evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red." So they're asking him, "Show us a sign." And he turns around and he starts telling them about their own ability to tell the weather. Verse 3, "And in the morning it'll be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. Hypocrites, you actors, you fakers. You know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seek after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." And he left them and departed. I think the first reason why this distorted thinking happens is because of something that I think of as mindless Christianity. Mindless Christianity. They used their mind in order to be able to tell about the seasons, to be able to tell about the weather, but they were being irrational about how they approached God. And one of the main places that they looked to was signs. The problem with signs is that we oftentimes fall into this thing called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias says this: if I believe my wife is angry at me or doesn't love me, then I will find many things that she may be doing for good for me, but my confirmation bias will only see them as bad, because I've already convinced myself that she doesn't love me. If my boss is trying to challenge me to get better, but all I can think about is my boss hates my guts, then every time my boss challenges me to get better, I'm going to simply see it not as an encouragement to get better, but as my boss hates my guts. Okay? The problem is when we look for signs and we don't use the rational mind that God has given us, we oftentimes fall into this distorted image of thinking. A few years back, a good friend of mine, I've shared this story with you all a number of times, a good friend of mine, he was leaving home, his mom told him, "Don't leave the house." It's during the middle of a snowstorm. And so he leaves the house, he's walking down the street to get to his car, happens, he slips, falls, breaks his leg, comes back home, and his mom doesn't embrace him with a hug. She says, "Did you see what God did you?" Okay? Distorted thinking can impact our view of God. It's this sign that somehow God has shown you what I wanted you to know, what I wanted you to accept. This is distorted thinking. This is mindless Christianity. Mindless Christianity. The other issue, again, is that we disregard the rational mind that God has given us to be in communion. And we simply say, like, "God, you just show me what I'm supposed to do. Just show me what I'm supposed to do. What should I do, God? Should I go to," and this was a question that I was asked in a very spiritual version here, of course, but God has given me these two options: St. John's University or Queen's College. This is, when I was in Queens for 8 years, I was given this question, I can't tell you how many times. And so one person came to me one time, very spiritually, insert sarcasm, and says to me, you know, I have prayed to see something. That if it's God's will for me to go to St. John's, that I would see a yellow Volkswagen Bug, but if it's His will for me to go to Queens, I would see a gray Honda Accord. All right? They're kind of stacking the deck here. Okay? But oftentimes what we're doing is we look for signs to confirm what it is that we ultimately believe. And what Jesus has said here is no sign will be given. He says the one sign is a sign of the risen Lord. The one sign, the one thing that we should be searching for is the risen Christ in our lives. He says the only sign you'll get is the sign of Jonah the prophet, who was in the belly of the whale, if you will. And so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and then rise again from the dead. Okay? So he tells us here, be careful of mindless Christianity. Seek to experience the risen Christ Himself. Use the rational mind that God has given you while living a life of communion with Him. And use that to engage with Him, to meet with Him, to experience Him more deeply, more profoundly. Folks, spirituality is not simply an emotional aspect. That is one very, very small aspect. But God has given us a mind to think about Him, to meditate upon Him. St. Paul actually tells us to the things that are good and holy and noble and worthy and praiseworthy and virtuous. He says meditate or think about these things. Use your mind to contemplate the things of God. The second reason why I believe this happens is I think sometimes we put Jesus inside of our own box. In verse 5, it says, now when His disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Jesus says to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they reason among themselves, saying, it's because we have no bread. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, you have little faith. Why do you reason among yourselves? Because you have brought no bread. Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000? How many baskets you took up? 7 loaves for the 4,000? How many large baskets you took up? So what's going on here is they said, listen, we had a certain experience. God worked with us in the past in a certain way. One time He took 5 loaves, fed 5,000 people. Another time He took 7 loaves, fed 4,000 people. Took up baskets both times. This time we got no bread. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? So we oftentimes put Jesus in our own little Jesus experience box and say this is exactly how God works every single time. And only the way that He's worked in my life is the way that He can work in anyone's lives. I think it's important to acknowledge that God is consistent, but He's not confined. God is consistent. He's not confined. He feeds the people. Sometimes with 5 loaves and feeds a lot more people, and this time with more loaves and feeds less people. But He can certainly feed people with no loaves. Okay? God's consistent. His message here, His desire here is to feed us. It's to commune with us, or for us to commune with Him. So it's consistent, but oftentimes we confine Him to work the exact way that He has worked in the past. That's the only way that He can work in our lives. We put Him in this little, tiny little box. One of the things that I think God was teaching me, personally, when He brought myself and my wife together, was that God certainly works in very different ways. We got one of us who was born and raised, spent their entire lives in the church from a young age serving God. And the other one of us, myself, who was out of the church for much of my life. And God worked in a very radical, miraculous way, I believe, in my life. And it was funny because when I first started my own journey with God, I presumed that if anyone didn't have an experience exactly like I did of Christ, that their experience somehow was superficial. And it was only until I met Maura, and I realized that her experience of God being in the church her whole life, and really seeking a deep personal relationship with God pretty much her whole life, and serving from a young age, I came to realize that God He interacts with people where they're at. And it's not my way or your way, it's that God is working with each of us where we're at. He's consistent. He's calling each of us to him, but he's not confined. So when he calls you, and he calls you a little bit different, and he calls you a little bit different, but he's calling us to the same table to eat with him, and to dine with him, and to commune with him. He's consistent, but he's not confined. That's why in this community, one of the things I believe is that diversity is not an issue. Diversity is not an issue. That he doesn't just, in my experience growing up, he only worked with Egyptian people. That's what I thought at least. Okay? That's what I believe. Only Egyptian people went to heaven. Okay? That's really what I believe. Because that's what I witnessed. That's what I experienced. That's what I saw. But one of the beautiful things that we're seeing happen here is that God's calling people from different nations, from different tongues and different tribes, together in this place to serve as a model for all of us. That though he's consistent, he's not confined. We can't put Jesus in our own little box and say this is the only way that Jesus Christ works. The third reason I think this happens is the influence of the family of origin. When Jesus, in verse 13, it says, Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi. He asked his disciples, saying, who do men say that I am? The Son of Man am. So they answered and said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Some say John the Baptist. John the Baptist, for those of you who had an upbringing where in your house Christianity was extreme asceticism, this is our version of Jesus that we got growing up. That Jesus is just, John the Baptist was an extremely ascetic man. I mean, this man pretty much wore a toga and walked around eating food or beans, fava beans, like all the time. Okay? He lived a very simple ascetic life. And so for the people who said that Jesus was John the Baptist, for them it was Christianity simply asceticism. That's what they reduced it down to, was extreme asceticism. That Christianity is simply praying vigils and fasting. That's it. For those who said that he was Elijah, Christianity was wonder working. That God only worked when there were miracles. Now remember Elijah. He's out there and he's having this kind of like this epic battle and with pagan priests, and he calls down fire from heaven and it burns up everything. So for those who say that Christianity is just about wonder working, these are the folks who chase after, like, anytime there's a miracle or a vision or a sign or something like that, these are the people that are constantly chasing after. Okay? These are the people who are saying, just show us a sign, show us a sign, show us. We want to see wonders. We want to see something cool happen. We want to see fireworks. Like, show us some divine explosions. We want to see an apparition. Like, there was a song, it was like, appear to us, appear to us, appear to us. And Jesus is like, you foolish, adulterous generation. He's like, just seek the risen Christ. Just seek me in your presence. For those who said he's Jeremiah, if you know anything about Jeremiah, he wrote a whole book called Lamentations. Lamentations is a lamenting. It's sadness. This is those who, like, for them, Christianity is just walking around being like sad and miserable all the time. We all know those folks. We know them. Christianity is all about just being sad. I was preaching a sermon during the St. Mary revival and walked into one of the churches and I was talking about joy. And next day, like, the priest saw me and he grabbed me and says, come here. He says, you're talking about joy. He's like, we're living in misery here. And he was laughing, he was joking. But some people, for them, Christianity is just about sadness. There's no joy there. There's no joy. And he's saying again, remember the sign of Jonah the prophet, the risen Christ. If you think about the risen Christ, it is a joyous celebration every single day. And for those who said he's just one of the prophets, and folks, for all of us, at some point, we may have received different aspects of this teaching. One of the prophets, Christianity, or the teaching of Jesus, is just, he's a nice prophet, he's a nice teacher. He's a good guy, good man. Yeah. So the family of origin can impact us so much to where it distorts our thinking about who God is. And that's why when Jesus calls the disciples, he tells them, unless if you hate your mother and brother and sister, even your own life, he says, if you're going to enter my family, then you got to put on my thinking. It's not about hating these folks. It's about understanding that you're entering a new family. That we do things according to the family of God. That we put on the mind of Christ. And that we think as God thinks. The fourth reason, I would say, is that, and I think you suggested it, is that we oftentimes project our perception on who God is, or maybe who we think God should be. In verse 21, for that time Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised on the third day. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, that this shall not happen to you. So for St. Peter, he was happy about, like, God is the magic genie, but not the suffering servant. Like, there was an image of who God should be that he was projecting. And anything short of that, St. Peter, and some of us, we fall into that place. We're like, we don't like that image of God. We're not comfortable with that. Or we prefer this instead. Like, we want the God who's going to, like, hook us up, like, with a nice ride. We want the God who's going to, like, take care of us, like, he's going to be our sugar daddy. Like, he's just going to take care of us all the time, whatever we want. God's going to, like, just give us a nice ride, get us some bling, get us, like, this is who God is. But the suffering servant, no. That's like on Good Friday, like once a year. The rest of the year, like, no thank you. Okay? Fifth and final is that the cost may be too high. Cost may be too high. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Take up his cross and follow me. Does God want you to be happy in your marriage? Like, people have asked me that question before. Does God, and I used to, like, my answer used to be yes. Used to. Not because I got married. Did I change my answer? But I read a book that really transformed my thinking about marriage. And the book is called Sacred Marriage. If you're married or you're thinking about getting married, it's a book that I highly recommend. Sacred Marriage, just to give you an idea, the subtitle of the book, is what if God intended marriage to make us holy more than to make us happy? And the premise of the book is this. If my goal of marriage is just to be happy, like, good luck. Because there will be some happy days and there will be some not so happy days. But if my goal of marriage is to make me holy, then I'll probably get both. I'll at least get holiness and most likely get happiness if both are seeking holiness in the marriage. Oftentimes the cost is too high though. Oftentimes, like, we're not comfortable with a certain image of God because it's like, it's difficult. Like, I want to tell you all who are married, marriage is difficult. It has its tough days. I'm blessed with an amazing woman, but marriage has tough days. The cost is high. The cost of walking with Jesus is high. And some of the disciples might not have been very comfortable with that. I want to give you a very simple solution. Okay? I told you there are big mistakes, but I think there are very simple solutions. I was driving by one of the mechanics on my block, and he had a nice little sign. He has always these inspirational quotes. And he says, life isn't complicated, we just make it that way. And I think there are these big mistakes, and the solutions, folks, they're simple. They're very simple. Okay? The solution for fixing this big mistake about wrong or distorted belief and how it affects the way of Jesus, or walking the way of Jesus, is that we simply get rooted in the life of Christ no matter the cost. We do whatever it takes to get rooted in the very life of Jesus Christ. Not just learning about Him intellectually, not just reading books about Him, not just going to church. All those things are good, but actually getting rooted into His life. Getting planted into His life. Think about John chapter 15. I am the vine, you are the branches. He says, I want you to be connected to me. I think when we get connected, we get rooted in the very life of Jesus Christ. No matter the cost, it'll help us with this distorted thinking. We've got to be willing to really become disciples of Christ. We've spoken before about not being fans, but about being followers of Jesus. Being a disciple of Christ means I'm walking with him the long road, the hard road. I'm just following Christ. I'm going to become a student of Christ. The disciple back in the days of Jesus walked around with their master. They walked around, they didn't, like, folks, they didn't go into the synagogue or the temple with Jesus and like sit with him. And then when he went home for like lunch, they would go home for lunch. No, they went and had lunch with Jesus. And then when he went and healed people, they went and watched him heal people. And then at a certain point, he says, now you're going to go heal people. And they're like, us? He's like, yeah, I'm sending you out. And then you're going to come back and tell me about the experience. And we're going to live together. We're going to live together. We're going to walk together. We're going to have life together. We're going to enjoy this idea of life as it was intended to be a life of communion. But we got to be willing to have the courage to be disciples of Jesus Christ. In verse 15, Jesus says to them, who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter responds and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered and said to them, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. My Father who is in heaven. We want to learn about who Jesus Christ is. And one of the beauties of the church, the body of Christ, and St. Paul talks about this in Hebrews chapter 10, I believe verse 23 and 4. He says, do not forsake the assembling together, as some have. And the idea of assembling together is that when we are together, we keep each other accountable. In the early church, the idea of consensus helps us to avoid heresy. So that if we're walking by ourselves, so if I'm walking by myself, if I'm walking on an island by myself, I guarantee you I'm going to start teaching some crazy stuff. Or I'm going to start thinking some distorted things about God. But when we come together, we challenge one another, we encourage one another, we speak, we discuss together. Okay? And our thinking about God gets refined. When our thinking about God gets refined and we grow together in our understanding of who God is, then our personal relationship with him not only becomes deeper, but with each other also becomes deeper. And then he sends us out to shine his lights more brightly. Belief, without question, impacts our behavior. Belief impacts our behavior. Okay? Now, all of these people are standing around. And Jesus is saying, who do men say that I am? And there's question marks on all their heads. And some of them said, we think you're Jonah, or Elijah, Jeremiah. And then one guy says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. One guy. And the rest came to believe that. What we believe about Christ affects how we live. What the disciples believed about Jesus impacted their willingness to die and shed their blood for the name of Christ. Proverbs 23 verse 7 tells us that he says, you are what you think. He says, for as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Whatever you think, this is what you become. You heard the saying, you are what you eat. Well, Proverbs, King Solomon says, you are what you think. You are what you think. As we think about God, this impacts how we live our lives because belief affects behavior. If we look at salvation, for instance, and we see salvation as a legalistic act, and we view salvation within the lens of legalism, a legal salvation, that I've just been forgiven this bucket of sins against me, then that's going to impact how I interact with God. Okay? If I view salvation as I was bad, now I have to be good, that's going to impact how I live out my relationship with God. If I view salvation as faith alone, then that's going to impact my walk with God, that it's just, I'm fine no matter what. If I view salvation as an act of synergy between God's grace and my will bringing me into a life of communion, that's going to impact how I interact with God. That third one being the Orthodox understanding of salvation. If my view of holy tradition is that within the Protestant or Reformed thinking, the Bible equals tradition. Okay? that's going to impact my view of God. That's going to impact my view of the world. I was recently having a conversation with a pastor from California. We were discussing this whole idea of tradition. And very interestingly, he thought that we had a very Catholic view of tradition. And by the end of the conversation, things we came to a common understanding of what tradition was or is. That's a nuanced subject, and we'll get into it perhaps in coming weeks. Okay. I saw this. So a friend of mine sent me this image at a Baptist church, and the bulletin for the week was services on hiatus. Pastor conflicted after reading church fathers. Okay. Because his view of the scripture completely changed after he read the church fathers or read it within the context of holy tradition. Within the Catholic idea of tradition, it's Bible and tradition. And within the Orthodox understanding, it's Bible within tradition. How we view the scripture, by the way, folks, and how we view tradition, what even is tradition, that's a loaded word, affects our view of God. It affects our view of the church. And ultimately will impact how we live our lives in the world. The last one is the Trinity. The Trinity. How we view, for some people, the Trinity is just this formula. 3 equals 1, and 1 times 1 equals 1, and 3 and 1 and 1 and 3, and it's just this funny formula that people are they can't figure out what the right combination of words is. But within the Orthodox life of the church, the idea of the Trinity is simply 3 persons that are eternally distinct and eternally one, eternally distinct in their personhood, eternally one in essence and love, and they make room for one another, and that impacts our life together as a community, as a people of God, as human beings. That with all of our differences, our particularities, we make room for each other. We love one another. We live our lives in purpose of one another, directed in love to each other. So our thinking about these things truly impacts how we view God. Because people have asked me, who cares about all this stuff? Well, these things actually impact our belief, affect our behavior. I don't want to get overly dogmatic this morning with y'all, but I think I want to leave you with 3 final thoughts. If we want to avoid and correct blinding beliefs, I'm going to give you 3 quick things. They have to do with awareness, orientation, and the effort or energy. Number 1 is we've got to be willing to reflect and think to grow in awareness. We have to be willing to reflect and think in order to grow in awareness. St. Paul said it. He says, whatever things, Philippians 4, whatever things, and he lists a bunch of good things, beautiful and virtuous. He says, meditate on those things. Think about those things. In 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, he says, examine yourselves, think about yourself, think about your life as to whether you are in the faith. He's speaking to the church in Corinth, and he's saying to them, test yourselves. Do you not know yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you, unless you indeed are disqualified? He's saying, examine yourselves, reflect on your life, reflect on your thinking, and think in order to grow in awareness. I really want to encourage, take time each day to pause and think about your day. Take time at the end of the day just to think, 5 minutes. End of the day. My spiritual father growing up, he told me, he's just 5 minutes at the end of the day, just sit and think about your day. Examine your day. Consider your day in light of your relationship with God. Be willing to think and reflect, not only about your life, but about your thinking about who God is. And perhaps if He wants to be more deeply and personally intimate with you than you currently are with Him. Number 2, is I want to encourage you to immerse yourself into scriptures and in the early Christian witness. Immerse your mind. Put on the mind of Christ. Be willing to go a little bit deeper. I can't tell you how many people are Christians and have not picked up the scriptures. I didn't start reading the scriptures until I was 24, 25. And once I started reading it for myself, I was like, wow, it's different. Because I was reading it to meet with Christ. My mother was in her early 60s when she first started reading the Bible. I'm not concerned if you're in college or if you're in your 50s or 60s. She picked it up in her after she had retired, and she started reading the Bible, doing Bible study. And she started spending more time in prayer as myself. And I share that with you just to simply say, like, it's there, it's accessible to us. Like, allow yourself to spend a little bit more time, not just thinking about your faith, but putting yourself in a place where you can be oriented, your mind, your soul, your whole life can be oriented with the mind of Christ. And third and finally is be willing to exert a little bit of energy to grow. We've got to be willing to get a little bit uncomfortable, folks. I know your schedules are busy. God knows how busy your schedule is. And I'm not going to guilt you as others may. But I simply want to tell you, if you want to grow, you've got to be willing to exert a little bit of effort, a little bit of energy. I'm not talking about getting saved here. I'm talking about just knowing God. I'm talking about if you want to grow in a relationship with someone. If I want to spend, Moore and I were just talking about this the other night. Because life is busy. Like, we don't have as much time together as we'd like. And we said, like, we gotta sacrifice. We gotta make some sacrifices to spend some time together. We can't continue like this. We just can't. Otherwise, we'll just grow further apart. We acknowledge it. Okay? We love each other dearly. Just like many of us, we love God dearly. Like, we want to know Him dearly. If we do, be willing to put a little bit of effort. Be willing to sit down and reflect and think. Be willing to, like, push yourself a little bit to get up a little bit earlier. Be willing to carry the cross a little bit. Be willing to sacrifice a little bit. Okay? If we're serious about anything, if we're serious about, like, passing exams, we're going to exercise some effort. Yeah? If we're serious about our marriages, same. If we're serious about our relationship with God, about just, even if we're still, like, at the first steps and we're not sure, I'm just telling you, like, be willing to take a couple of steps and see what God does. See where God leads you. See where God leads you. There is a cost, but I believe the payoff is tremendous. The payoff of walking in a life with God is tremendous. The fruit that you will bear in your life. And I hesitate to say this because the goal for us should not, I'm going to walk with God so I can have peace. I'm going to walk with God so that I can, like, become a better person. We should walk with God because, like, God is just that good. But I will tell you that walking with Him, and as good as He is, that the beauty of walking with Him is that, like, things that we didn't expect or think possible, like, He begins just to pour out blessings on us. Any questions?